Welcome to episode 2 of the Cause Effect 4.0 podcast. I'm Celina Lee, and today we're diving into one of the most urgent questions for Africa's future. Can the continent turn its AI talent into real climate innovation, or are we training the next generation only to see them leave in search of better infrastructure abroad? My guest today is Rendani Mbuvha, co-founder of the AfriClimate AI, a movement pushing for climate change policies, data access, and grassroots education that will put Africans in the driver's seat of AI solutions for climate change. Welcome, Rendani.
Thank you for having me.
So you have a really interesting background. You recently got your PhD in engineering. You come from Limpopo in South Africa, and you're now the founder of AfriClimate AI. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about your journey and how you came to starting AfriClimate.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's yeah. As you mentioned, I grew up in Limpopo, for most of my early years, and then I studied in Cape Town. And after my matriculating, I studied actuarial science at the University of Cape Town. And post studying actuarial science, I then worked in the insurance industry in South Africa, particularly in the health insurance industry. I qualified as an actuary, and then I got really interested in data. And this was really the early days of AI, and when we used phrases like data analytics, and those kind of things to encapsulate most things that were, predictive statistics and perhaps a little bit of ML. But after qualifying as an actuary, actually, I decided that I probably need to learn more about how to work with data and then the emerging techniques there. And then I was lucky to get a scholarship to move to Stockholm at the Royal Institute of Technology and do a master's in machine learning. After 2 years in Stockholm, which was really, really a transformative time for me in terms of, getting interested in research and so on and so on, and particularly as I did my master's thesis in renewable energy forecasting, which was supporting actually at a startup that was supporting a lot of the energy trading in the North Pool in Europe. When I came back to South Africa, I joined Wits University, and while I was doing my PhD at the University of Johannesburg. A few years later, after working at Wits as a lecturer while doing my PhD, I then worked as a Google DeepMind fellow in London, and that's where really the transition to AfriClimate AI came about, where with the gracious support of Google and DeepMind. And I did a fellowship was totally independent, on problems that I cared about, and this gave me an opportunity to pursue an intersection of AI, predictive uncertainty, and one of the most uncertain things in sort of like in many disciplines is climate. And that's where we sort of started thinking about, how to do things like seasonal forecasting. So that was actually the initial lens that I got interested in AI for climate. But then after that, I was invited to the Deep Learning Mbuvha in 2023 in Accra. I gave a talk about my work, which was a little bit about seasonal forecasting in Africa and how AI can help, but also about the challenges, some of them particularly data-driven and data focused. It just so happened, it was actually a tough talk to give because it was actually at the same time slot as Nando de Freitas, but there were a few people who actually joined my talk. And those that did felt that the sort of challenges that I faced in my work were relatively similar to those in theirs. And then actually the Q&A session of that talk was more around how do we start a community, how do we come together and then build something that both facilitates research in AI and climate in Africa, but also capacity build in terms of harnessing talent and so on. And that's really when we started 2 years ago, almost to the date, on AfriClimate AI, and this is where we are today.
Yeah, that's amazing. We also find that I love the people with actuarial backgrounds. I mean, it's the combination of that hard math that is the foundation of AI plus real world problems that you're constantly looking at. So AfriClimate AI, you founded it. It came out of the Deep Learning Mbuvha 2 years ago. But can you tell us in a nutshell, what is AfriClimate AI?
Yeah, so AfriClimate AI is a grassroots community. Particularly, our mission is really enabling climate resilience in Africa through harnessing AI. We almost have almost three legs to that. One is to say capacity build. So we hold workshops. We've just had one in Kigali and the Deep Learning Ndava, and that's really a place to showcase research within the continent. And again, to provide a space for young and emerging researchers to sort of showcase their work. And also we do, on the capacity building leg, we also do webinars and sessions like that again tries to link people to what's going on, but also build capacity. And then on the other end, we actually do research and development in sort of like the areas that we prioritize on the basis of critical need. And in the main at the moment, we're working on research and development in particularly in AI weather forecasting. We presented actually at the Indaba one of our founding studies on understanding rainfall over the continent, and that's really important when it comes to how we interact with AI-based weather models. What data sets are relevant for the continent and how we imagine that. And that's really the R&D sort of component, and all of that is underpinned by our third leg, which is more around local impact and context.
And then what are the challenges and the opportunities, I guess, that are particular to the African context?
This is more a technical word, but it's representation ability. So ability to represent different phenomena, and climate and weather generates tons and tons of data. And as we're starting to develop architectures and sort of essentially tools that allows us to represent this fairly high frequency, high dimensional data, it allows us to gain quite a bit of insight and predictability in areas where were quite difficult. I mean, one of the areas, of course, as I've mentioned before, is in the area of weather forecast, where we try to figure out, what are the dynamics within the cloud, when is it going to move, are very difficult to parameterize at the micro scale. But however, you can learn implicit relationships through AI, the representations that I've just mentioned. And that allows us to have more accurate forecasts. Also, from a geospatial AI perspective, it allows us to analyze data from satellites, different sort of, again, both surface and Earth observation data, for us to have different levels of predictability. And maybe also to say, lastly, we're starting to see that we do not require, particularly at inference time, more in terms of issuing predictions after training and stuff like that, we do not require as much compute resources we did before. And therefore, this puts stuff like, weather forecasting models at the hands of people in their laptops and democratizes that in that
and
particular
why is that
area.
Though? But why does it require less now?
So in the main, it's really in terms of the optimization, in terms of the architectures that the way we solve for things like weather prediction at the moment. For example, in the past, or even currently, we use systems of differential equations in very high dimensions, in terms of both space and time. And therefore, usually would require an HPC facility for you to actually predict the weather tomorrow. But then in terms of some of the chips that are already optimized, like GPUs for neural networks and models like that, they allow us to then do forecasts that do not rely on that high those Navier-Stokes equations, but actually on fairly optimized neural networks that allow us to then do training is still taking quite a bit of time, but issuing predictions is often very low cost in terms of time. So I think I've seen statistics that range between 1,000 times speed up to 3,500 times speed up in terms of some of this model.
Wow, amazing. So it's going to make the inference more accessible, or guess the model and the prediction, the weather forecast more accessible. What are the realities on the ground in Africa versus the realities on the ground, I guess, in a more data mature environment like the US or Europe?
Yeah. I think there's often we talk a lot about the AI opportunity of Africa, particularly in the weather, climate, and sustainability space. But often, you need observation data, and that's what we're starting to see a little bit of, both in terms of existence of the data, but also access to the data. So, for example, a lot of including our study that we presented last week, relies on a lot of forecasts, particularly the AI-driven ones at the moment, rely on gridded data sets. Often what that means is You've agreed over the extent of spatial extent or an area or a continent. And in there's essentially some approximations or inferences on what temperatures are at a particular time, what precipitation is at a particular time. But often what happens is a lot of that data that is used to train this AI models is actually from reanalysis models or sometimes from satellite observations. And in many ways over the African continent, we do not have sufficient observations sometimes to calibrate those models, or those reanalysis data sets do not assimilate well in terms of representing the climate of our continent. So what that means, therefore, is that when you start looking at, building a forecasting model over, say Europe versus Africa, you kind of need to start from the data question first to say, is the data set that I'm using, relatively sort of, skillful in terms of what the reflection of surface observations in particular in the region that I'm working in. There's a proliferation of satellite products, reanalysis products that can then be used to train these models. But really what you want to find is over the continent, which areas of different products been verified such that they're usable to build AI in that continent, in that context, or perhaps also, and as I mentioned earlier, are there local partners that can help bias correct those data sets with local observation data for you to train on. So it's really, and I think there's multiple actors, and I have to recognize a few of them, like the United Nations with the early warnings falls initiative. They're actually funding, the systemic observation facility for different countries to have weather stations.
I see. The podcast is called The Cause Effect. And how would you describe the cause that you're fighting for? What is the cause that you're fighting for?
Oh, that's actually that's a very loaded sort of question. Yeah, I think in terms of describing the cause that we're fighting for at the moment, it's often in the case of can we use AI, I guess at a higher level, to support what I would call prosperity in over the continent as it relates to weather, and that prosperity being unpacked would look like something like protecting life and property in terms of the increasing variability that comes with climate change in the weather time scale and trends in the climate time scale. And second, also in terms of creating an environment where we could use AI to get more certainty even at the micro level for planning. So in the sense that by that I mean if a farmer can get a forecast that tells them about onset in a rainy season, what does that look like? If different countries can plan from a food security point of view over a medium term horizon, empowered by both data and the models that take it into account. I think that's really a world where AfriClimate wants to sort of envision seeing, and of course that being enabled by local capacity. That is a big one for us as well.
Yeah. What are the most important things that need to be put in place to enable this? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the data availability, or maybe the data exists and just being able to have access to the data or the capabilities on the ground. Yeah, what are the things that we need to do?
Yeah. I think there's. I mean, I don't think any of this is really something that is achievable by a single organization. It comes from perhaps an intersection of resources in terms of people, making resources available to organizations that want to make this happen, and more importantly, partnerships where we think interests are fairly aligned in terms of. Part of this work that we do is supporting institutions like National Weather and Meteorological Services, and in that, in some cases they have access to a bit more data, and that could again support building capacity within the internal ranks as we move towards this. And again, multilateral sort of collaboration across different jurisdictions, because issues of climate and weather and literally no borders, right? So the weather doesn't change from one country to another, and therefore we have to be cognizant of that in terms of to say, if we understand, say, how carbon sinks are working in the Congo, that has a lot of implications in terms of how we understand dynamics across the region and perhaps even in terms of knock-on effects in the rest of the world. So I think it's quite important that, collaborations between different organizations, those that have, local insights, knowledge, and data, as well as global institutions that can support in terms of technology, funding, and so on in different areas. I think that's the only way we can make an impact in this direction.
Right. It has to be a multi-stakeholder approach.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you and I connected only recently, surprisingly,
Yeah.
and it's because of the project that we're doing with Tamo and Google DeepMind. Can you give us some context? I mean, I'm so excited about the competition that we'll be launching on Zindi, but can you give us some context about like the work that that AfriClimate is doing with Tamo and Google DeepMind as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'll perhaps start by, by giving a shout out to the team at Tamo. I think Tamo is a very, very important organization across the continent. They're the Trans-African Hydrometeorological Observatory. And what they do is they're an NGO that exists to essentially increase the surface observation capacity across the continent. And they have a network of over 700 weather stations across the African continent, predominantly in East Africa, West Africa, and some in Southern Africa as well. And what often that allows us to do, it gives data that supports researchers and also supports the National Meteorological Services. But one of the biggest bottlenecks in terms of, again, as I mentioned, increasing the observation capacity in terms of data collection over the continent is the issue of maintenance. Because what happens is you put an automatic weather station on the ground. It gives essentially sometimes every 15 minutes, sometimes every 5 minutes, what's happening in terms of temperature, pressure, and rainfall if there is. But you can't. What you actually want to see is that it's one thing having a weather station down, but the most important thing is keeping it running for long. And there are different sort of maintenance issues that could occur, like a clogged rain gauge, and then therefore you start misreading rainfall, or you start getting zeros, and instead of actually reading the rainfall. And that's really important because rainfall events in many parts of the continent are few and far between. And so when it happens, you really want to measure it correctly. And the challenge that we have on Zindi is to address exactly that, is to work with Tamo on the basis of their data on the few stations that they've given us access to start building AI algorithms that allows us to detect clogging events in rain gauges, in automatic weather stations. But not only just to detect them, but to detect them ahead of time, such that you have predictive maintenance. Because the moment you detect it after it has happened, you've lost data that you could have collected, right? So that's really the challenge that we're going to work on. And of course, the impact of that is increasing the uptime in terms of the amount of data that the stations are able to collect. And therefore, that also allows us to not only use the solution for Tamo, but the weather time series that you get in these types of stations scales really well to other meteorological services that have the same maintenance challenge. So we see the downstream impact of developing algorithms such as this quite important in supporting, I guess, increasing the size and quality of the data on the continent.
Yeah. You mentioned there's 700, I guess, sensors or stations. What countries are they in, or is it too many countries to even name?
Yeah, it's too many countries to name, but I can name quite a few. I think Kenya is a big one. Rwanda has, which we've just been to, has a few. Ghana has actually quite a few as well. But it's actually their footprint is really massive across the continent. Pan-African. Yeah.
That's amazing. And I think this is an important point that it's not just about the data that is being collected to report that data, but it's also that it's a feeder into, so the competition we're running on Zindi is a predictive maintenance to increase the quality of the data. But once that data is available, it's not just about reporting the data, but it's also about feeding it into models that can allow for more accurate forecasting, right? I do have a question. I mean, we are working with Google DeepMind. They made the GraphCast model an open source weather prediction model that's open to the public. What are some of the limitations? I mean, in terms of how that model, is able to be used. What are some of the limitations? How will this Tamo data potentially, or other localized African data sets, help?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the work that Google DeepMind and a few other tech labs have been doing in the climate and weather space is really commendable. So I think one of the things that we have actually discussed with the weather team at Google DeepMind and a few of our collaborators has been that, a lot of, because AI takes in quite a bit of data, and also it takes in quite a lot of usually clean data, because in the particular case, um, reanalysis products, particularly those from the European Center for Medium Range Forecast, Weather Forecasting, ECMWF, are quite popular in training these models. So the research question that we've been posing and also doing a bit of benchmarking on has been, is there a five sufficient ground truth? And with the gracious support of google.org, we received funding to work in South Africa to look at ways to fine tune the model in collaboration with, the weather services in the country, agricultural research councils in the country, to actually then move into a space where you've got a globally trained model, but that can be fine-tuned, bias-corrected, and in weather speak, use model output statistics that you can actually better, I'd say, make it more specific to a particular region, and that's really the exciting one. And that's often probably what we'll likely see in the AI for weather space, because in many ways, a lot of the loss functions in these models are often, global average, and nobody really experiences global average weather. So you find that, in the well-represented areas, that's probably, again, that representativity, you get different levels of skill, and therefore, post-processing efforts like this is actually quite interesting as well.
And I imagine that the work that you do in South Africa will have implications like across the continent as well as
Yes.
around the world.
Yeah. So exactly. So what we are working on is not necessarily, we're working on essentially creating a toolkit that allows, that will be open source, and that will allow, and we call actually the project Focused for Africa, that allows different met services in different areas to actually, plug into different models, not just GraphCast or specific models, but there'll be a suite of models that you could actually perform different, what I'll call, localization operations. And therefore, again, that enables different met services who have quite a bit of data as well, and also the mandates to produce forecasts, access to AI-based weather forecasts. We're piloting this in South Africa because as a co-development partner, such that we get a sort of like a framework to get this done, and sort of proof of concept on how to do this in partnership with the relevant authority.
Yeah. And I lived in South Africa for many years and experienced, years of drought where, the smallholder farmers, well, agriculture was deeply impacted for many years. And then we
Mhm.
had a year of like massive flooding.
Mhm.
I mean, what is the potential impact that something like this can have on,
Mhm.
like, who will this impact? What will
Yeah,
it do?
exactly. Yeah, so I think what we're working on is a medium range forecast. Usually, the sort of extent, or what I say, how far out you look out in the medium range forecast is about 1 to 14 days, usually 10 days in reality. But what that allows us to do, particularly for climate hazards, it allows us to issue, well, not necessarily us, but those empowered with those models, to issue warnings, because you're 10 days out, you can see anomalies coming out, and you can actually plan for. So that's really what we want this, the impact of these models to be. And I mean, that's, I guess, perhaps in a disaster risk management area, but you also have people who are planning their planting seasons. And again, you can then see the medium range time scale, or perhaps even slightly further in a subsequent time scale, when the rains will come. And that affects, again, when you start your planting calendars and things like that. So we're thinking, in terms of the impact and translation of some of these forecasts, good impact in early warnings and disaster risk management, and also particularly in agriculture as well.
Yeah, which is so important in this time of real almost unpredictability in
Yeah,
climate.
exactly. Yeah.
What does success look like? Where do you see Afroclimate AI going? Yeah, what do
Mm.
you want to see?
Yeah, so I think in terms of what success looks like in our areas, we see Climate AI as the community of researchers that help translate AI technology in the weather space to the institutions that need it the most. So we, as I mentioned, for example, building an open source package that allows essentially for localization of weather forecasts. That allows the National Meteorological Services to plug into that and other sort of users. So in terms of our envisioned success, it's often about empowering people, both in terms of the researchers that we work with, as well as the institutions that we partner with, to have increased capacity in terms of skill in the area of AI and how it applies to their work, but also to have these tools in the hands of those who need it the most, such that they can have the downstream impact in terms of early warning, planning. Because at the end of the day, I'm an academic, my day job. But to be honest, you really don't want to translate, an RMSE or a scale number to just leave it there in terms of a paper or something else. But these types of forecasts are really decision support tools, and we really want to have this kind of tools and the most valuable when they support making decisions. And we really want to build that capacity and translate some of that technology in terms of the open source work that we do to empower those who make these types of decisions.
Yes, that's amazing. Okay, well, thanks so much for your time. Thank you for joining us, Rendani.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you so much.